Stegosaurus, the armored king of the Jurassic, with a tail that could crush bone and plates impervious to attack. Yet, it vanished mysteriously, millions of years before the Great Extinction. No meteor, no massacre, only secrets buried in stone. What could defeat the invincible? Let us know where you're watching from and what you think about this mystery. Step into the past and uncover a lost era. They called it the Armored King. For millions of years during the Late Jurassic, Stegosaurus was a statement of overwhelming defensive power. An animal so dominant, so recognizable, its silhouette became synonymous with the age of giants. Picture it, a colossal herbivore lumbering across the North American floodplains. A spiked tail, the deadly thagomizer, held high, and a double row of massive diamond-shaped plates running down its spine. It was a creature built for permanence, a fortress of flesh and bone that demanded respect from every predator, from Allosaurus down. Stegosaurus was not just a dinosaur, it was an evolutionary triumph, a perfectly engineered machine of survival. Yet, this icon vanished. Its disappearance is one of the most frustrating cold cases in all of paleontology, because the victim didn't succumb to the legendary cataclysmic asteroid strike that ended the Cretaceous period. Stegosaurus, along with its entire family lineage, the Stegosaurids, was gone, extinct, at least 65 million years before that final, great tragedy. It didn't lose the war. It simply vanished quietly from the battlefield long before the final shots were fired. This wasn't a sudden, mass casualty event. It was a slow, agonizing fade-out of an entire dynasty. The conventional, simple answer often tossed around is that everything was changing too fast. A classic, vague appeal to evolutionary pressure. But when we look closely at the fossil evidence, particularly the rich record of the Morrison Formation, that answer feels too convenient, too unsatisfying. How does a creature of such supreme dominance, with such a potent defense mechanism, simply surrender its crown? We aren't looking for a single moment of destruction. We're investigating a profound mystery, the quiet, systematic breakdown of a seemingly unbreakable evolutionary empire. The extinction of Stegosaurus wasn't an accident. It was a failure to adapt. The question is, to what? Now, let's open the case file on one of prehistory's greatest unsolved mysteries. Our initial investigation into the disappearance of Stegosaurus begins by profiling the potential culprits, the forces of change that could dismantle an empire of armor. In the lexicon of paleontology, we treat these hypotheses as our prime suspects: climate change, competitive displacement, and resource pressure. We need to assess the motive, opportunity, and, most importantly, the alibi for each one. Our first suspect is often the easiest to blame: climate change. The Late Jurassic was a dynamic period, and there is clear geological evidence of fluctuating sea levels and shifts in global temperatures. Motive: environmental stress. Opportunity: a changing world. The question is, did the climate shift quickly or severely enough to overcome an animal as successful as Stegosaurus? The fossil record shows that while the Jurassic was cooling, it wasn't a sudden deep freeze scenario. Stegosaurus was already established across a vast swath of the ancient supercontinent of Laurasia, suggesting a wide degree of thermal tolerance. The shift was gradual, unfolding over millions of years. Successful species usually migrate or adapt over such timescales. The demise of Stegosaurus was not synchronized with a single, devastating climatic event. Its more resilient contemporaries, the long-necked sauropods and the first ceratopsians, powered through these mild shifts. Therefore, the climate change suspect, while present at the scene, has a weak alibi for being the single, decisive killer. It likely contributed to the stress, but it wasn't the smoking gun. This leads us directly to Suspect 2, competitive displacement. The motive here is biological warfare, the rise of a new, more efficient herbivore that outcompeted the armored giant for food. We must examine the who and the when. Following the disappearance of the Stegosaurids, the ecological niche they occupied, that of a low to mid-level grazer, was increasingly filled by two new groups: the larger, more efficient, long-necked titanosaurs, a subgroup of sauropods, and perhaps most crucially, the rapidly diversifying ornithopods, the ancestors of the duck-billed dinosaurs. The titans, with their enormous size and incredibly long necks, could access vegetation Stegosaurus couldn't reach, and their massive gut systems were arguably more efficient at processing the tough Jurassic flora. More compelling, however, are the ornithopods. These agile, often bipedal herbivores were equipped with increasingly sophisticated dental batteries and jaw mechanisms, designed for superior grinding and cropping of plants. Unlike the relatively simple leaf-shredding capability of Stegosaurus, the ornithopods were becoming the specialized, high-efficiency processors of the dinosaur world. As the environment became less uniformly lush and more patchy, a mild contribution from our first suspect, climate change, the specialized feeding apparatus of the emerging ornithopods, would have given them an insurmountable advantage. The evidence comes from the paleogeographic timeline. By the beginning of the early Cretaceous, the vast, continuous ecosystems of the Late Jurassic had begun to break apart. In North America, where Stegosaurus had been king, it was replaced by the ornithopod lineage. In China, where stegosaurs lingered slightly longer, they also eventually gave way to new herbivore dynasties. The evidence suggests a gradual, systematic takeover of the food supply by superior competitors. This is a powerful, compelling motive. Stegosaurus was simply out-evolved and out-grazed. Its slow, laborious movement and relatively low-level feeding range made it a poor contender in a changing ecological arms race. Competitive displacement is a primary suspect, but even it doesn't fully explain the complete and total annihilation of the lineage across the globe. Some stegosaurs should have clung on in isolated pockets. The case needs a deeper, more profound explanation. The common factor in the collapse of the stegosaurs across different continents points to a global mechanism, a systemic failure that undermined the very foundation of their existence. When we move beyond biological suspects and look at the deep geological record, the evidence from the Earth itself, a final, massive tectonic upheaval emerges as the ultimate architect of their downfall. Ecological fragmentation, driven by continental drift. Stegosaurus thrived during a period when the continents were still relatively connected and stable. The Morrison Formation in North America was a vast, continuous floodplain, providing enormous, uninterrupted habitats and migration corridors. The entire stegosaur family flourished under these conditions of high connectivity, wide range, and stable, simple plant life. But starting at the very end of the Jurassic and accelerating into the early Cretaceous, the supercontinent of Pangaea, which had been fragmenting for some time, began to dramatically pull apart. This process was not merely a change in scenery. It was a fundamental shift in the planet's operating system. The land masses that broke away, South America, Africa, Australia, became ecological islands. The vast contiguous habitats that had allowed stegosaurs to dominate were replaced by smaller, isolated, and rapidly diverging ecosystems. This is a critical pivot in our investigation. Isolation breeds specialization and rapid evolution in new groups, while simultaneously rendering widespread, generalized, but slow-evolving groups like Stegosaurus vulnerable. The armored king was a product of the Jurassic supercontinent. It needed vast, stable territories to support its large body and relatively simple lifestyle. As the continents broke up, each fragment became a natural laboratory for new, localized evolutionary experiments such as the rise of more specialized ornithopods in different regions. Stegosaurus, unable to rapidly evolve specialized feeding or defensive strategies to suit 1,000 newly isolated habitats, found its continuous kingdom fractured into a series of disconnected, vulnerable fiefdoms. The fragmented landscape prevented effective migration, trapped localized populations, and subjected them to intense, specific competitive and environmental pressures from which they could not escape. The slow tectonic movement provided the motive and the mechanism for the total, global elimination of the Stegosaur dynasty. It was the conspiracy that allowed all the other pressures, climate and competition, to succeed. The evidence is overwhelming. We started with two distinct suspects: climate change and competitive displacement. But the deeper we analyzed the geological timeline, the clearer it became that neither acted alone. Our final verdict is a synthesis, a diagnosis of a systemic, environmental conspiracy, the perfect storm of ecological fragmentation. Stegosaurus was not killed by a sudden, devastating blow, but slowly suffocated by a series of linked, compounding pressures. The armored giant was a victim of its own success, perfectly adapted to the vast, homogeneous landscapes of the Late Jurassic. Its limitations became fatal flaws only when the world itself changed its fundamental geography. The primary culprit, continental drift, fractured the supercontinent and, with it, the foundation of the Stegosaurus domain. This fragmentation had a threefold deadly effect. First, it trapped populations in smaller, isolated territories, preventing the necessary gene flow and widespread distribution that had once ensured their survival against local catastrophe. Second, it created diverse environmental pressures that demanded rapid, specialized adaptation, a capability the slow-evolving stegosaurs simply lacked. They continued to be broad, generalized grazers when the fragmented world needed precise specialists. Third, and most critical, the isolation amplified the power of the secondary suspects. The mild, global cooling, climate change, may have been survivable in a continuous ecosystem where populations could migrate to warmer latitudes, but in isolated pockets, it became a lethal stressor. The rise of the more efficient ornithopods, competitive displacement, would have been a manageable localized threat in a massive territory. However, when confined to isolated shrinking habitats, these new, specialized competitors delivered the fatal economic blow, simply outgrazing the less efficient Stegosaurus until its resource base collapsed. The plate-carrying monarch of the Jurassic was unable to compete, unable to flee, and ultimately, unable to change. The final fossil record confirms this narrative. While stegosaurs vanished almost entirely from the major continents like North America early in the Cretaceous, a few relict forms, small, evolutionary dead ends, clung on in peripheral regions, like Werhosaurus in China, proving the dynasty didn't immediately cease to exist. But these isolated forms were the exception, not the rule. And they too eventually faded, unable to re-establish the continental dominance their ancestors enjoyed. The Great Armored Body Plan, once a symbol of invincibility, became a legacy of failure in a world that no longer valued bulk and static defense over agility and specialized feeding. The Jurassic King died because its world broke into pieces. The case file on the Stegosaurus lineage is now officially closed. The final verdict confirms that dominance is fleeting and that the greatest threat to a highly successful species is often not a larger predator or a single cataclysm, but the slow, relentless power of systemic change. The disappearance of this iconic giant, long before the final curtain call of the Cretaceous, stands as a profound lesson in evolutionary history. A reminder that in the unforgiving laboratory of Earth, adaptation is the only true armor.